EU leaders have agreed to raise a €90 billion loan to fund Ukraine for the next 2 years, having stopped short of adopting a proposal to use tens of billions of euro in frozen Russian assets to underwrite a long-term funding package. This morning, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin said he was disappointed there was no unanimity on using Russian assets, saying Moscow could still be held accountable in the long term. That decision was among a number of issues addressed by Russia's President Vladimir Putin when he delivered his marathon annual end-of-year press conference in Moscow earlier.
After 17 hours of negotiation, EU leaders agreed to provide funding for Ukraine for the next 2 years. A total of €90 billion will be raised on the international capital markets, borrowed against unused funds in the EU budget and passed on as an interest-free loan to Ukraine. Some €210 billion in Russian assets will remain immobilised. If Moscow does not pay reparations to Ukraine after the war, then the EU reserves the right to use those assets to repay the loan to Ukraine.
We will provide a loan backed by the European Union budget. This will address the urgent financial needs of Ukraine. And Ukraine will only repay this loan once Russia pays reparations.
Belgium, which hosts the bulk of the assets via a Belgian securities company, had long resisted the assets plan in case Russia successfully sued for the money to be returned. It was clear that the open-ended guarantees that Belgium was seeking were too much for the other leaders. So a plan B, straightforward borrowing, was revived.
This is a stable, legally robust and financially credible European solution. It is chartered waters we are sailing. And that is essential to keep Ukraine in the fight, to ensure continuity and to protect Europe's commitment to Ukraine in the long term.
The Taoiseach, who's long argued that Russian assets would force Moscow to pay for its destruction of Ukraine, had reservations.
My view still holds that if a country violates the UN Charter, invades a neighbour, destroys its infrastructure, is responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people, their own people as well, in terms of the Russian soldiers who have died unnecessarily, then there has to be responsibility and accountability.
The outcome will provide urgently needed breathing space for Ukraine, even if there has been a degree of gloating in Moscow. The emphasis in Brussels was on unity and a belief that the frozen Russian assets will continue to be important leverage.
The world according to Vladimir Putin. That's what was on offer today as the Russian president delivered his annual, highly orchestrated end-of-year press conference. And it didn't take long for him to refer to those unsuccessful EU efforts to use Russia's frozen assets to fund the newly agreed loan to Ukraine.
Theft is not the appropriate term. Theft is the secret appropriation of property. But in our country, they're trying to do it openly. It's daylight robbery. Why can't this robbery be carried out? Because the consequences could be grave for the robbers.
He also showed no compromise on his military objectives in Ukraine, claiming that Kyiv was the one blocking efforts to secure peace, despite increased dialogue.
Essentially, they're refusing to end this conflict peacefully. But still, we see and sense and are aware of certain signals, including from the Kyiv regime, that they're ready to engage in some kind of dialogue. The only thing I want to say is that we've always said this. We're ready and willing to end this conflict peacefully.
But it is a peace on his terms, with the same tough conditions attached, which have already been described by Ukraine and the EU as unacceptable.
I'm here, okay.
On a visit to Warsaw today, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky hailed the EU's new €90 billion loan when he met with Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Europe showed leadership, and this is very important and tough, strong position. Thank you.
This meeting, a show of support from a key ally at this crucial time. Kate Varley, RTÉ News.
Now our Europe editor Tony Connolly joins us live from Brussels. Tony, as the dust settles on this Ukraine funding agreement, there will be further talks on Ukraine this weekend. What can we expect?
That's right. There are going to be further talks between US and Ukrainian officials at the weekend in Miami. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, may join those talks. So there is enormous pressure by the Trump administration on Ukraine to perhaps agree to a peace plan even before Christmas. So that's why getting this lifeline in the early hours of the morning was very important for Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, obviously, EU leaders find it pretty galling that they're being lectured on legal rights by Russia, given that Moscow has breached every conceivable aspect of international law with its invasion. But there is a sense in Brussels, I think, now that as these talks get closer to potentially a much more substantive set of negotiations, the EU is still having to rely on the United States for information about positions that Russia has. They don't really have a seat at the table. So Emmanuel Macron saying last night that perhaps the EU should open up some kind of back channel to the Russian president. Now, in terms of the assets themselves, of course, they're still frozen. They could be used again in a couple of years' time if Russia doesn't make reparations. But one senses that the same problems will arise, Belgium's reservations. And think about it, in 2027, we could have a far-right leader of France who would be a lot more perhaps sympathetic to the Russian view. So it's hard to see how these Russian assets in any sense in the future will be used to repay that loan for Ukraine.
Tony Connolly in Brussels, thank you.